On the 1st of November 1700, a doctor in Madrid cut open the body of Charles II of Spain and wrote that the king contained not a single drop of blood, that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his intestines rotten, his lungs corroded, and that he had a single testicle black as coal. His head, the doctor added, was full of water. That autopsy report is genuine. It is also almost certainly exaggerated. But even stripped of its theatrical language, the body on that table was the end product of something no doctor in 1700 had the vocabulary to explain. Charles II was more inbred than the child of a brother and sister. Not because his parents were siblings, they were uncle and niece. But 2 centuries of accumulated cousin marriages, uncle-niece pairings, and recycled bloodlines had compressed his family tree so tightly that the math came out worse than incest. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254. A child born to a brother and sister averages 0.25. The Habsburgs did not stumble into this. They chose it generation after generation, with papal dispensations in hand and crowns on the table, and they paid for it in dead children, broken bodies, and eventually the largest European war of its era. This is the dynasty that married its way to power and bred itself into extinction. Centuries later, a Latin couplet would get attached to the Habsburgs like a brand slogan: Bella geranta lii, tu Felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. The line showed up on Habsburg wedding programs from the 1680s onward, and everyone assumed it belonged to Maximilian I, the grandfather of Charles V, the man who arguably perfected the marriage strategy. It did not. The complete couplet does not appear in print until 1718, 2 centuries after Maximilian died. The first 3 words come from Ovid. A cardinal named Lorenzo Gonzaga was using Bella geranta lii as his personal motto in 1566. The Habsburgs took it, polished it, and claimed it as their founding philosophy. The strategy itself, though, was real, and it worked brilliantly for about 100 years. In 1477, Maximilian married Mary of Burgundy in Ghent. She was 20, the richest heiress in Europe, and the key to blocking Louis XI of France from swallowing the Burgundian inheritance. In 1496, Maximilian's son Philip the Handsome married Joanna of Castile, locking in an alliance with the Catholic monarchs against France. In 1515, the Vienna Double Wedding paired Maximilian's grandchildren with the Jagiellonian heirs of Hungary and Bohemia. When Louis II died at Mohacs in 1526, both crowns fell to the Habsburgs. 3 generations and 3 marriages produced half of Europe. The official Habsburg historical institution calls these strategically concluded marriages. That is a polite way of describing a dynasty that treated weddings the way other families treated sieges. 3 generations produced more territory than decades of warfare, and none of it cost a single soldier. The problem is what happens when you win too much. By the time Charles V held Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Low Countries, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and the American colonies, the number of families worth marrying had shrunk to almost nothing. The Habsburgs needed spouses of equivalent rank, which meant other Habsburgs. The Spanish branch married the Austrian branch and vice versa, recycling the same bloodlines that had built the empire. The marriages that created the power became the marriages that destroyed the dynasty's ability to sustain it. Every crown they added narrowed the pool of acceptable partners until the pool was a puddle. Most people who have heard of the Habsburg jaw assume it came from one woman, Cymburgis of Masovia, a Polish Piast princess who married Duke Ernest the Iron around 1412 in Krakow. Robert Burton blamed her in The Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621, and the story stuck. It makes for a clean origin point. One foreign bride, one bad gene. Disaster. The problem is that portraits of Habsburg men show the trait before Cymburgis ever arrived. Albert II, Duke of Austria, who died in 1358, has it. Rudolf IV, whose tomb portrait at the Stephansdom in Vienna is the oldest surviving life portrait of any European ruler, died in 1365 with a visible underbite. That portrait predates the Cymburgis marriage by nearly 50 years. Skeletal analysis of Rudolf's sister Elizabeth showed prognathism too. No portrait of Cymburgis herself shows the jaw at all. Contemporary chronicles describe her as a beautiful and imposing woman of great physical strength, who could break horseshoes with her bare hands. Nobody mentioned her face being unusual. Brigitte Hayman, whose biographical lexicon of the Habsburgs remains the standard German reference, does not endorse the Cymburgis hypothesis. The trait was already running through the Albertine line by the early 1300s. Cymburgis did not introduce a new defect. Inbreeding amplified an existing recessive allele that had been quietly sitting in the family gene pool for at least a century. And here is the detail that almost never makes it into popular coverage. The Habsburg jaw is not really about the lower jaw being too big. It is about the upper jaw being too small. A 2019 study by Velazquez and colleagues had 10 maxillofacial surgeons score 66 portraits of 15 Habsburgs across both the Spanish and Austrian branches. They measured 18 separate features, 11 related to mandibular prognathism and 7 related to maxillary deficiency. The two conditions correlated at R equals 0.711, meaning they travelled together. The statistical regression against inbreeding coefficients was significant. The trait is recessive. The highest scorer for the actual jaw protrusion was Philip IV, not Charles II, Philip IV. The highest scorers for maxillary deficiency were a 5-way tie: Maximilian I, Margaret of Austria, Charles V, Philip IV, and Charles II. The face most people associate with Habsburg inbreeding is mostly a problem of the middle face caving inward, not the chin pushing outward. Charles V was the first Habsburg whose jaw seriously interfered with daily life. The most reliable primary observers were Venetian ambassadors, whose dispatches back to the Senate were detailed, unsentimental, and less concerned with flattery than any other diplomatic source in 16th century Europe. They noted that his upper and lower teeth could never meet. He could not chew solid food properly and suffered chronic stomach illness from badly digested meals. He ate his words when he spoke, and one ambassador wrote that his mouth hung perpetually open, looking very unbecoming. Court painters, Titian among them, learned to paint his lips slightly parted to soften the underbite. Bernard van Orly did the same in his Flemish portraits. It was a studio convention. Never paint the king with his mouth closed because his mouth never was. Charles V conquered most of Italy, held the Holy Roman Empire together through wars with France, the Ottomans, and the Protestant princes, and abdicated voluntarily to spend his last years at the monastery of Yusti in Extremadura. Severe gout crippled him from middle age. He likely had diabetes. He died of malaria on the 21st of September, 1558, at 58, which by the standards of his era was a respectable lifespan for a man who had spent 30 years campaigning across Europe on horseback. His jaw did not stop him from becoming the most powerful man in Europe, but the trait was getting worse with each generation, and nobody was paying attention to why. His son Philip II married his first cousin Maria Manuela of Portugal. Their son, Don Carlos, had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.211 and only 4 distinct great-grandparents instead of 8. He was born with unequal leg lengths, a curved spine, one shoulder higher than the other, a chest deformity, and a speech defect. Venetian ambassadors Jeronimo Soranzo and Paolo Tiepolo reported that he roasted small animals alive, blinded all the horses in the royal stables, threw a page out of a palace window over a trivial offence, and forced a shoemaker to eat a pair of boots that displeased him. He attacked the Duke of Alba with a knife in early 1567. His own confessor and Don John of Austria reported that he plotted to assassinate his father. In April 1562 at Alcalá de Henares, Carlos fell down a staircase. He was 18. The head trauma was catastrophic. Weeks of semicoma, infection, temporary blindness, spiking fevers. A trepanation was performed. Andreas Vesalius was summoned, though his exact role is disputed. Relics of Fray Diego de Alcala were pressed against the wound, and the friar was later canonized partly because Carlos survived. A modern neurosurgical reassessment published in Child's Nervous System in 2015 argued that the injury caused a frontal lobe contusion, which would explain the subsequent disinhibition and violence. Whether Carlos was already unstable or whether the staircase made him worse is impossible to separate cleanly. What is documented is that on the night of January 17, 1568, Philip II entered his son's bedchamber in the Alcazar of Madrid wearing full armour, accompanied by 4 councillors. They sealed the windows, removed the weapons, and declared the prince under arrest. Carlos spent 6 months confined. He alternated between hunger strikes and binge eating. He swallowed a diamond ring. He drank gallons of iced water and slept on an ice-covered floor, reportedly trying to break a malarial fever. He died on July 24, 1568. Popular history says Philip had him poisoned. That narrative comes from William the Silent's Apology of 1581, which was Dutch revolt propaganda, and it was later immortalised by Schiller's play and Verdi's opera. Geoffrey Parker and Henry Carman, the two most authoritative Philip II biographers, both reject it. Carlos died of self-induced starvation, combined with a malaria recurrence. No poison needed. His body was already failing. Then there was Joanna of Castile, mother of Charles V, the woman history calls the mad. She is one of the strongest cases for revisionism in the entire Habsburg story, because the popular version is almost entirely wrong. The standard account goes like this. Joanna went insane with grief after her husband Philip the Handsome died in 1506. She dragged his coffin around Spain, refused to let anyone bury him, kept the body at her bedside, and was eventually locked away at Tordesillas for 46 years as a raving lunatic. Bethany Aram, in a 2005 study, dismantled most of this. Philip died suddenly in Burgos on September the 25th, 1506, probably of typhoid. Joanna had promised him burial at the Royal Chapel of Granada, which was his own request. She transported his coffin toward Granada. The coffin was opened 3 times total, twice for standard religious confirmation rituals of the period, and once because she suspected grave robbers, which was a rational fear given that without a buried body, the funeral arrangements and her inheritance claim would be invalid. She did not keep the coffin permanently at her bedside or at her dinner table. That image comes from 19th century romantic painting and a 2001 Spanish film. What actually happened to Joanna is more disturbing than madness. 3 men in succession, her husband Philip, her father Ferdinand of Aragon, and her son Charles V, each personally benefited from declaring her unfit to rule. None of them allowed independent verification. Her jailer at Tordesillas, a man named Mosen Ferrer, used rope torture with weights on her. When Cardinal Cisneros investigated after Ferdinand died in 1516, he discovered this and suspended Ferrer for endangering the health and life of Her Highness. During the Comuneros Revolt of 1520, the rebels held Tordesillas for 103 days and begged Joanna to sign documents legitimizing their cause. She repeatedly stalled with shrewd legalistic excuses. Aram reads this as deliberate strategic non-action. If Joanna was genuinely incapacitated, she would not have been capable of sustained legal evasion. She was not necessarily mad. She was politically inconvenient to 3 consecutive rulers who each needed her out of the way. She spent 46 years locked in that fortress, the last 35 under her own son. There was genuine mental illness in the family. Joanna's maternal grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, suffered postpartum psychosis after giving birth to the future Isabella I. She was confined at the castle of Arevalo with hallucinations and catatonic states. Joanna's grandson Don Carlos and her great-granddaughter Maria of Austria were both described as mentally unstable by contemporaries. The predisposition was real. Whether it justified 46 years of confinement with rope torture in a fortress administered by a man her own government had to suspend for cruelty is a separate question. The confinement was vastly disproportionate to any documented condition, and every man who enforced it gained politically from doing so. Philip IV is where the body count becomes impossible to ignore. He had at least 12 known legitimate children across 2 marriages. With his first wife, Elizabeth of France, 7 children were born. 1 survived to adulthood. Maria Theresa, who would marry Louis XIV. His heir, Balthazar Charles, died of smallpox at 16, and that death is what forced the second marriage. Philip needed a male heir, and the available bride of sufficient rank was his own niece, Mariana of Austria. She was originally betrothed to Balthazar Charles. When Balthazar died, the father married the dead son's fiancée. She was 30 years younger than Philip. The wedding took place at Navalcarnero on October 7, 1649. With Mariana, 5 children were born. 3 of those 5 were dead before the age of 4. The pattern across those 5 is blunt. Epilepsy in 2 of them, gross congenital weakness in Charles II, infant death in Ferdinand Thomas at 10 months, and obstetric exhaustion killing Margaret Theresa at 21 after 6 pregnancies in 6 years. Margaret Theresa is the girl in Las Meninas. Velazquez painted her when she was 5. By 14, she was married to her maternal uncle Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. He was 26. He called her Gretel. By 21, she was dead, 4 months into her 7th pregnancy, her body wrecked by continuous childbearing and respiratory illness. Of her 6 completed pregnancies, 1 child survived past 4 months. Her brother Philip Prospero is the other Velazquez portrait worth knowing. He was born in 1657 and painted in 1659, aged 2, at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. In the portrait he's wearing protective amulets, a coral cornicello, a jet figure and bells, folk magic objects meant to ward off the evil eye. The court was so worried about this child dying that they painted him in talismans. He died of an epileptic seizure at the Royal Alcazar on November 1, 1661. 5 days later, Charles II was born. The replacement heir arrived before the mourning ended. Habsburg infant mortality between 1527 and 1661 ran at 29.4%. Nearly 1 in 3 royal babies dead before their first birthday. Contemporary Spanish village infant mortality in the same period was roughly 20%. Royal children with wet nurses, physicians, heated palaces, and unlimited food were dying at 1.5 times the rate of peasant children. The class gradient inverted completely. Charles II was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched. The nickname tells you everything about how the 17th century understood genetics, which is to say, not at all. His court physicians did not blame his bloodline, they blamed sorcery. Alexander Stanhope, the British minister at Madrid from 1690 to 1699, left the most reliable outside observations. He wrote to the Duke of Shrewsbury in 1694 that Charles's lower jaw stood so far out that his 2 rows of teeth could not meet, and that he had a ravenous stomach and swallowed all he ate whole. Charles was big-headed and weak as a baby. He could not walk unaided until at least age 6. He did not speak intelligibly until age 4, and had what contemporaries described as a locked tongue for the rest of his life. He drooled constantly because he could not close his mouth. He began puberty around 14 and never completed it. 2 marriages produced no children. In 1698, Inquisitor General Tomás de Rocaberti and Inquisitor Froilan Diaz launched an investigation into whether Charles had been cursed. They interrogated nuns who claimed to be possessed, and those nuns identified a hex from 1675 involving poisoned chocolate. The prescribed treatment included placing dead pigeons on the king's head. This was the Spanish Empire's response to the most visible genetic deterioration in European royal history, an exorcism. No one at the time had the conceptual vocabulary to connect consanguinity to illness. The concept did not exist. The first scientific work linking inbreeding to health problems would not arrive until the 19th century. The Habsburgs were not ignoring a known risk. They were operating inside a world where the risk was invisible, and where the papacy handed out dispensations for close-kin marriages like receipts. 9 of 11 Spanish Habsburg marriages between 1450 and 1700 required papal dispensation. 2 were uncle-niece. 1 was a double first-cousin marriage. Charles V controlled most of Italy after the Battle of Pavia and the sack of Rome, which gave the Habsburgs decisive political pressure over the papacy. Dispensations were easy to get. Protestant reformers rejected uncle-niece dispensations entirely, which is why this particular kind of marriage is so concentrated in Catholic Habsburg practice and virtually absent in Protestant Europe. The most important detail about Charles II's pedigree is also the most commonly bungled on the internet. Popular videos repeat that his 2 grandmothers were sisters. They were not. Margaret of Austria was Charles II's paternal grandmother. Maria Anna of Spain was his maternal grandmother. Maria Anna was Margaret's daughter, so Margaret was simultaneously Charles II's paternal grandmother and his maternal great-grandmother. The pedigree collapse is real and extreme without needing the wrong version. Charles II had 4 distinct great-grandparents instead of 8. Half of that generation was missing. In 2009, a team led by Gonzalo Alvarez reconstructed the Habsburg pedigree from more than 3,000 individuals across 16 generations. The resulting paper remains the foundational genetic study of the dynasty. The inbreeding coefficients they calculated show a dynasty sliding toward a cliff. Philip I, the founder of the Spanish line, had an F of 0.025, mild. His son Charles I, better known as Emperor Charles V, was at 0.037, still manageable. Philip II jumped to 0.123, roughly between first cousin and uncle-niece levels. Philip III reached 0.218, nearly equivalent to half-siblings. Philip IV dropped slightly to 0.115. Then Charles II hit 0.254. That number matters because of what it means about recessive alleles. Every human carries a handful of broken gene copies that cause no harm as long as there is a working copy on the other chromosome. In an outbred population, the odds of both parents carrying the same broken copy are low. In a pedigree this compressed, those odds climb with every generation. Charles II inherited 200 years of accumulating recessive load filtered through a shrinking pool. Not one bad gene, dozens, possibly hundreds, all converging in the same body. The 2009 paper proposed that Charles II had two simultaneous homozygous recessive disorders: combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his short stature, muscle weakness, late puberty, impotence and infertility, and distal renal tubular acidosis, which would account for his skeletal weakness, large head, and blood in his urine. That dual diagnosis became the standard citation. Almost nobody mentions the rebuttal. A group of Cambridge nephrologists annotated the paper, pointing out that most patients with the gene mutations that cause recessive distal renal tubular acidosis develop severe bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. No contemporary source describes Charles II as deaf. The weakness and skeletal deformities the paper attributed to kidney disease are also classic symptoms of vitamin D deficiency, which was endemic in 17th century Europe and not specific to any genetic disorder. In 2021, a paper in BMJ Neurology Open proposed a single disease alternative: aspartyl glucosaminuria, a lysosomal storage disorder. It fits the full clinical picture in one diagnosis instead of two. The facial features, the intellectual disability, the speech problems, the skeletal deformities, the recurring infections, the seizures, the infertility. A separate 2019 paper in European Neurology proposed hydrocephalus from a perinatal herpes simplex infection, which would fit the autopsy line about his head being full of water. Neither paper disputes the underlying inbreeding analysis. They use it. The inbreeding makes any recessive disorder more plausible, not less. The honest answer is that we do not know what Charles II had, because no DNA from Charles II or any Spanish Habsburg king has ever been published. The Capuchin crypt in Vienna and the Royal Pantheon at El Escorial in Spain have not allowed sampling. The entire genetic case for the Habsburgs rests on pedigree analysis, not molecular evidence. That is worth saying plainly, because the confidence of the popular narrative outstrips the actual data by a wide margin. The Habsburgs were not the only dynasty to inbreed. The Ptolemies of Egypt practiced brother-sister marriage as routine policy for 275 years. Cleopatra VII's parents were full siblings. On average, the Ptolemies were closer kin than the Habsburgs ever got. But the Ptolemaic dynasty was ended by Roman conquest, not biology. Tutankhamun, likely a full sibling product himself, had extensive skeletal pathology and died around 19, but the pharaonic system did not depend on a single heir the way Spain did. The Bourbons also crossed into consanguineous territory when Louis XIV married Maria Theresa of Spain. They were double first cousins. Their son, the Grand Dauphin, had an inbreeding coefficient around 0.13. The Bourbons outbred quickly in the next generation, and the problem diluted itself. No other ruling Catholic European house reached Habsburg-level cumulative inbreeding. Only the Ptolemies exceeded them, and those marriages were brother-sister, which is a different category entirely. What made the Habsburgs unusual was not any single marriage. It was the repetition. Uncle-niece, then cousin, then uncle-niece again, then cousin again. Over 11 Spanish marriages between 1450 and 1700, the same genetic material got folded back on itself until the pedigree looked less like a tree and more like a vine wrapped around a single post. The consequences did not stop with Charles II. Ferdinand I of Austria, born in 1793, is the Habsburg everyone forgets. His parents, Francis II and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, were double first cousins who shared all 4 grandparents. Ferdinand had only 4 great-grandparents, the same pedigree collapse that had produced Charles II nearly a century earlier. He had hydrocephalus, an enlarged head disproportionate to his body. He suffered from severe epilepsy, with court physicians reporting up to 20 seizures per day. He had a speech impediment, motor difficulties, and rickets as a child. At age 9, he reportedly could not pour himself a glass of water, open a door, or climb stairs without help. On his 1831 wedding night to Maria Anna of Savoy, Ferdinand suffered 5 seizures during attempted consummation. The marriage produced no children. The apocryphal anecdote about Ferdinand, the one that shows up in every light history of the Habsburgs, is the dumplings line, "I am the emperor, and I want apricot dumplings." There is no primary source for it. It first appears in 19th century Viennese folklore, and some versions substitute noodles for dumplings. The reason it endures is that it captures something true about how Ferdinand was perceived. A man whose title exceeded his capacity. He was not a complete invalid, though. He was literate, kept a coherent diary, spoke 5 languages with difficulty but intelligibly, and played the piano. Brigitte Hermann noted flashes of dry wit. He stayed on the throne because Metternich insisted that the legal line of primogeniture be preserved to avoid the precedent of choosing a monarch. The actual governing was done by a committee: Archduke Louis, Count Kolowrat, and Metternich himself. Ferdinand abdicated on December 2, 1848, at Olomouc during the revolutions sweeping Europe, in favour of his 18-year-old nephew Franz Joseph. He lived another 27 years quietly in Prague, which is more than most Habsburgs managed. Ferdinand is proof that the lesson of the Spanish branch did not fully register. Even after the Spanish line died out in 1700, the Austrian Habsburgs continued marrying cousins for another century. The double first cousin marriage that produced Ferdinand happened 93 years after Charles II's death. The intellectual tools for understanding consanguinity existed by then, at least in embryonic form. The marriages continued anyway. Charles II died childless in 1700, but the dynasty's final off-ramp had already closed a year earlier, killed by smallpox in Brussels. Margaret Theresa's only surviving child, Maria Antonia of Austria, had married Maximilian II Emmanuel, Elector of Bavaria, in 1685. This was an outcross, a marriage outside the Habsburg pool. It was the genetic escape hatch the dynasty needed. Maria Antonia had a son, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, in October 1692. She died 2 months later, at 23, of postpartum infection and what contemporaries described as a deep state of melancholy. Joseph Ferdinand grew up as the compromise candidate. Charles II, with no children of his own, named the boy sole heir to the entire undivided Spanish Empire in his will of November 1698. The first partition treaty between France, England, and the Dutch Republic endorsed him. Every major power agreed this 6-year-old would inherit Spain and prevent war. On February 6, 1699, Joseph Ferdinand died of smallpox in Brussels. He was 6 years old. Rumours that his grandfather Leopold I had him poisoned were never substantiated. It was smallpox, a disease that did not care about partition treaties or the survival of dynasties. His death forced Charles II to write a new will. He named Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon grandson of Louis XIV, as his heir. The Habsburgs refused to accept it. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714, killed somewhere between 700,000 and 1.25 million people, and redrew the map of Europe. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 and the Treaty of Rastatt in 1714 carved up Spain's empire like a carcass. Britain took Gibraltar, which it still holds, along with Minorca and the Asiento de Negros, a 30-year monopoly on the slave trade to Spanish America. Austria took the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. Savoy received Sicily. Philip V kept Spain and the American colonies, but renounced any claim to the French throne. Spain went from the dominant power in Europe to a second-tier kingdom permanently. France was financially gutted. The settlement is widely treated as the beginning of the British global empire. If Joseph Ferdinand had survived, none of this happens. A 6-year-old boy with Bavarian blood inherits Spain, the Bourbon claim evaporates, and the war that killed 700,000 people never gets fought. The dynasty's dying ember was not extinguished by Charles II's biology directly. It was extinguished by smallpox hitting one child in one city in one winter. There is a dissenting view, and it deserves mention. Henry Kamen, who has spent decades on Spanish history, argues that Spain's decline was structural, not biological. His position is that Spain was never really an independent great power at all. It was an economic colony of northern Europe, dependent on Genoese and Dutch credit, running on American silver that flowed straight through Seville to pay debts in Antwerp. Under Cayman's reading, Charles II's infertility is incidental. The empire was always living on borrowed time, and the Treaty of Utrecht just revealed what was already true. Cayman has a point about the structural fragility. Spain's domestic economy was weak throughout the 16th century. But structural fragility and biological catastrophe are not mutually exclusive explanations. A healthy heir who could command loyalty and produce successors might not have prevented long-term economic decline, but he would have prevented the succession crisis that killed 700,000 people. The war happened because there was no heir. The heir did not exist because 2 centuries of consanguinity had destroyed the reproductive capacity of the royal line. Cayman's argument explains why Spain might have declined eventually. Biology explains why it happened violently all at once at the worst possible moment. A dynasty's inbreeding rewrote the balance of power for the next 2.5 centuries. The Austrian Habsburgs learned the lesson that the Spanish branch never did. In 1736, Maria Theresa married Francis Stephen of Lorraine, who had no recent Habsburg blood at all. That single marriage diluted the inbreeding load so sharply that 10 of their 16 children survived to adulthood, a healthy rate by 18th century standards. Their children included Joseph II, Leopold II, and Marie Antoinette. Otto von Habsburg, the last heir of Austria-Hungary, died in 2011 at the age of 98. No jaw. 12 generations after the Lorraine outcross. One marriage that reached outside the bloodline was enough to reset the genetic clock. The Spanish Habsburgs never made that choice. They kept the pool closed, kept the dispensations coming, and bred themselves into a peppercorn heart on a table in Madrid. The jaw that Titian painted around is gone. What remains is the lesson. Blood is not a strategy. It is a resource, and resources run out.